Today, we will be representing Australia. Australia is a country and a continent and is located in Oceania between the Indian Ocean and the South Pacific Ocean. As a stakeholder, we represent the whole of Australia. With Australia sitting so close to Antarctica, climate change will eventually have both a devastating and fast-paced effect. For example, South Australia alone has a large amount of its main cities positioned on the coastline. These cities are at great risk of being inundated with seawater as the sea levels begin to rise, which has already begun. There is the potential for greater surges of storms, specifically on the coastline. This will impact any coastal sediments, infrastructure, and ecosystems based around the ocean. There is a potential for 31,000 to 48,000 residential buildings and houses to be inundated from a sea level rise of up to 1.1 metres, causing anywhere between $5 and $8 billion of damage. As well as this, approximately 6,763 kilometres of South Australian roads, 219 kilometres of railway, and up to 1,488 commercial buildings will be damaged from the sea level rise. These assets will set Australian government back a collective $37.4 billion in damages. As well as infrastructure damage, the levels of potable water will drastically decline, with hotter and drier climates as a result of the effects of climate change. By 2050, the Murray-Darling Basin levels will have dropped significantly with the rising salinity levels. At present, the average number of days that South Australia experiences at over 35 degrees annually is 17. With the effects of climate change, this number could rise to 21 to 26 days by 2030 and 24 to 47 days by 2070. The system of government that Australia has been utilising is a liberal democratic tradition. This includes religious tolerance, freedom of speech and association. It similarly reflects a British or North American structure while still being uniquely Australian. While the citizens of Australia vote to appoint a party into power, that political party appoints a single leader to represent them, and this person then becomes Prime Minister.
The Australian government has made it clear that something needs to be done about climate change in order to slow down the process. Global warming is occurring extremely quickly, at a much faster pace than was first thought. It is being pointed out that the Australian economy will be greatly affected if nothing is done to reduce our carbon emissions. Thus, the Australian government views climate change in a negative light and is working to reduce the impacts of it on the Australian economy, environment, and the well-being of its citizens. The Australian community is also aware that climate change is a huge issue in our society. However, some members of the community are more active than others in trying to slow down the process of global warming. In order for more changes to be made within the community, climate change and the impacts of it need to be thoroughly understood. Often only a small amount of people truly understand the impact that climate change can have, in particular on future generations, and thus only a small amount of people will make changes in their everyday lives, such as walking to work instead of driving. According to Healy in 2014, the cause of climate change from the viewpoint of Australia is the extensive release of carbon emissions into the environment, which causes excess carbon to be trapped in the Earth's atmosphere. Both natural and human influences have contributed to the extensive release of carbon emissions. However, it is thought to be likely that human influences have had the most impact on the increase in the Earth's temperature. Currently, Australia is encouraging the use of renewable energy sources and discouraging our over-reliance on fossil fuels in order to decrease our carbon emissions. According to Chowdhury in 2012, the Small-Scale Renewable Energy Scheme in Australia aims to incentivise individuals and small businesses to install renewable energy systems such as solar panels, wind systems, hydro systems, solar water heaters and air source heat pumps. This financial incentive is done through the creation of small-scale technology certificates. Australia also has a National Energy Productivity Plan, also known as the NEPP, where the value that we get from our investment in energy is measured. By improving energy productivity, Australia will become more competitive, therefore helping consumers manage their energy costs and reducing Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. The Australian government has set an energy productivity target, improving Australia's energy productivity by 40% between 2015 and 2030.
In 1979, the World Climate Conference first voiced concerns regarding the link between increasing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. In Australia the following year, the Australian Academy of Science reviewed 20 years of data which measured increasing carbon dioxide levels within the atmosphere. However, as the idea of climate change was still in its infancy during this time, it was not until 1985 that scientists at a United Nations conference issued a statement calling for international action, which was followed up in 1988 with the setting of the Toronto Targets, an international plan to reduce 20% of carbon dioxide emissions worldwide by 2005. Many believe that the climate change debate has only become apparent in Australia over the past decade, although it was in 1989 that this policy was first considered by the Australian Federal Cabinet, which was transpired into the 1990 Labor election campaign. From 1992 to 2002, the federal government issued its National Greenhouse Response Strategy, following Australia's sanctioning of the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, which essentially adopted voluntary measures as action against climate change, but these were largely critiqued as ineffective. In January 2003, the New South Wales government introduced the world's first mandatory emissions trading scheme for greenhouse gases. Then, the following year, together with the other states and territories, they formed the National Emissions Trading Task Force, which focused on constructing comprehensive policy frameworks for further emissions trading schemes. In 2006, Prime Minister John Howard sanctioned the establishment of a joint government business task force called the Prime Ministerial Task Group on Emissions Trading, and following this, it was in 2007 that emissions trading was first introduced, preceding Australia's climate change policy released in July of the same year. Following the election of the Labor Party in 2007, the new government agreed to endorse the Kyoto Protocol to employ a national emissions trading scheme and cut Australia's greenhouse gas emissions by 60% by 2050, which came into effect in 2008. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, at the time, claimed that climate change was top priority of the new Australian government, and under Rudd's leadership, numerous papers and bills were submitted to the Senate for consideration, leading to the passing of new legislation under the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme. At the 2010 federal election, the reappointment of the Australian Labor Party in power saw the introduction of a carbon price. This carbon price initiated as a fixed tax rate to industry contributors, but was expected to transition into another emissions trading scheme within 3 to 5 years, and coincided with the passing of the Clean Energy Act.
In July 2011, Australia's then Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, made public plans to introduce a carbon tax to combat climate change. The carbon tax would see Australia's biggest polluters paying a tax of $23 per tonne of their own carbon emissions. Revenue from the proposed tax would assist industries in their development to cleaner forms of energy, and after time would be invested into wind, solar and other renewable energy sources. Prior to the imposition of the carbon tax, opposition leader Tony Abbott raised concerns of the tax's potential impacts on jobs, the cost of living and the threat to the future of coal mining. Julia Gillard was then successful in introducing the carbon tax from 1 July 2012, but Tony Abbott, following a successful election campaign, repealed the policy on 17 July 2014, leaving Australia with no active policy towards reducing carbon emissions. A 2015 study by Meng, Siriwardana and McNeil on the effectiveness of the carbon tax has deemed the policy can and did successfully cut carbon emissions, but not without the possibility of a mild economic decline. As a country, we now find ourselves politically and economically restricted in our responses to climate change. On the one hand, we had a policy that was proven to be effective. Carbon emissions decreased by about 70 megatons, but on the other hand, we faced negative campaigns that the carbon tax would, quote, cause a large economic contraction, high unemployment, higher electricity prices, and the demise of a coal industry. Another underestimated restriction in Australia's response to climate change is the attitude of the public, both wholly and individually. Torsten Grothman and Anthony Pratt provide that people often underestimate the likelihood of a potential hazard affecting them, with dire consequences. They argue that as a society we should not undertake to adapt to climate change at a point in the future when we begin to notice its effects, but adaptation should begin now and be ongoing. The image shown here was constructed by Grothman and Patt in 2005 and depicts various stages and routes in adapting to climate change. The first stage is titled Social Disclosure on Climate Change Risks and Adaptation and is situated in the top left corner of the image. The following stages are both titled Perception and lead onto the stages of either climate change risk appraisal or adaptation appraisal. From here, the paths branch out, some being more direct than others, but all finish at the ultimate stage of adaptation. The paths within this image allow us to understand the process of adaptation and the restrictions it places on our country's response to climate change. Outcomes stemming from perceived probability and perceived severity, such as fatalism, denial, and wishful thinking, show signs of avoidance in the need to adapt to climate change.
Historically, Australia's climate change approach through legislation and policies has been considered erratic and unfocused. However, the focal point over the past few years has been on increasing renewable energy usage, delivering practical change at a local level, and cutting greenhouse gas emissions through carbon pricing mechanisms. This is all being achieved in the form of target schemes and plans in an effort to combat climate change, reduce our carbon footprint, and encourage our citizens to acknowledge the growing threat of climate change. The majority of the Australian government's focus is rightfully on the domestic electricity sector, with it contributing to 1/3 of the Australian greenhouse gas emission output. Nowadays, Australia is making use of its abundant access to solar, wind, geothermal and wave energy by being one of only 96 countries to have designed government policies to facilitate and increase investment in renewable energy technologies. For example, the current Australian renewable energy target is to accomplish 20% renewable energy contribution by 2020. This is being achieved through 2 financial incentive schemes which drive investment in renewable energy. The large-scale renewable energy scheme is focused on large-scale projects such as wind and solar farms and hydroelectric power stations by encouraging their establishment or expansion. In contrast, the small-scale renewable energy scheme is focused on promoting households, small businesses and community groups to install small-scale energy systems. The success of the renewable energy target is evident with renewable energy capacity doubling to date. The target is also persuasively promoting renewable energy and by helping make it an accessible and affordable option for individuals. Therefore, it is a distinctively successful strategy to begin to address climate change, especially if it is used in conjunction with other effective programs.
The immensity of global warming is formidable. In order to stave off the catastrophic effects of climate change, we must begin implementing the best solutions to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions, further reducing carbon impact. Drastic changes must be done to significantly reduce domestic carbon pollution, promote investment in large-scale renewable energy projects, and to protect our forests' flora and fauna. As Australia's primary energy source, coal and coal-fired plants are highly probable in becoming more efficient in producing less greenhouse gas. This can only be made possible if billions of dollars of new investment is to be made, and the only way to address the crisis is to enforce a tax on the exploitation of coal. Due to strong worldwide awareness in demand for energy and enhanced energy technologies, the cost of all forms of energy has risen, making the current oil prices high enough to encourage significant investments to new oil field production. Many, but not all Australians are taking climate change seriously, as best substantiated by a range of personal mitigation actions. For example, through baby steps such as changing light bulbs, cold water washing, and hiking instead of using a vehicle, to setting up various distributed energy options including solar, hot water systems, or purchasing green power. Action on climate change will only be successful through the combined efforts of the government, industry, and the public at large. We have a choice, and all we need is action.